Presidente.
Grazie. Riprendiamo la...
Let's re-adjourn the meeting. First of all, let me inform you that pursuant to Article 3, Paragraph 3(4) of the Rules of Procedure, the Commissioners' meeting, the Legal Affairs Committee carried out verification of credentials of Swiss Malenji de Grandmaison, Johannes Lebech, Christian Rolsing. So I propose that we adopt these mandates. Are there any objections? No, so these credentials have been verified. The Presidency has received various requests for amendments from the EPP group to the parliamentary committees and interparliamentary committees. The list of names is in the minutes of that meeting. If no objections are raised up to adoption of the minutes, then these names are going to be adopted as contained in the minutes. Let's now look at the agenda with the oral question to the Commission on a European Roma strategy. Mrs. Yeroka has the floor, first of all, who has written a question. So Mrs. Yeroka has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, the Presidency, the 2005 Parliament resolution, the 2004 Commission research paper, the Women's Rights Committee report of the European Parliament, and the 2003 action plan by the OSCE all point to the situation of the Roma in Europe, but little progress has been made in this field. Even though Europe's labour market and European societies need the successful integration of the Roma. The high-level expert group created by Commissioner Spidla submitted recommendations to a community action plan. We need this community action plan, but we need to act urgently, for which we need more commitment from the European Commission. The same is true for the European Parliament, civil society. We need to help the Roma in every aspect of their situation. The European Commission must act as an initiator and try to finance the programs hand in hand with the Member States. When using community financial instruments and absorbing community funds, we must pay more attention to equal opportunities and non-discrimination through action plans and more analysis and reports. If this action plan becomes part and parcel of the implementation of community funds, that could help greatly the social integration of this biggest of all European minorities. It is also essential to establish a pan-European crisis map to map out the grey spots in Europe where the Roma live in the worst conditions. Once again, we need the European Commission to help the Member States in the desegregation action programs which have been delayed for decades. It's important to act in various portfolios: education, employment, equal opportunities, regional development, and so on and so forth. These commissioners should coordinate their activities and, together with the civil society and Parliament, elaborate an action plan by 2008 which could greatly improve the situation of the Roma, and we should also start implementing this action plan in addition to the resolution that we adopted in 2005, which has had little effect in the European Union. I believe it's very important to focus on this issue, but it's not resolutions that we need, it's real dialogue that we need with the Commission and with NGOs. The year 2008 should be about action, matching our words with deeds on the ground. And on behalf of the EPP group, I can offer you my support during the year 2008.
Grazie per illustrare.
Thank you very much. The second oral question, Angelini has the floor for 2 minutes.
Signor Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. This morning we approved a report on the European strategy for minority rights. One of the priorities is tackling poverty and discrimination. As such, we wanted to devote a specific paragraph to Roma children who often live in health, education, exclusion. There's a high percentage of young Roma who don't go to school or go infrequently. Many Roma children are often compelled to go to segregated schools, different schools, or if not, for children with special needs. Statistics suggest that in some member states, fewer than 60% of Roma children go to school. Of course, if a child doesn't go to school, they're often illiterate or they're not properly educated or have significant professional training. That means no future. That means needing welfare or ending up working on the black market. That means they're often condemned to poverty and social exclusion. And in the worst cases, they fall prey to organised crime. We should remember as such that the Roma population is very young. Around 45% of people are under 16. And therefore, it would make sense for the Commission to provide for specific measures and concrete measures for young people among the Roma population, especially in terms of tackling education deficiency and ensuring there's proper schooling and high quality education. Without a right to studies, there's no chance of equal treatment. Particularly, there's no right to a future. Thank you.
Thank you. And now moving on to the third question, Mr. Visma for 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. We've also put a question to the Commission, and I expect the Commissioner to answer this later. The main thrust this evening of our debate is to talk about the European Union and the European Commission's approach to the whole question of the problem with Romas. This has been an ongoing issue for many years, but this year it's become far more topical, and it really has reached the consciousness of EU citizens as a whole. And in many cases, the way in which this specific group of citizens is treated is quite unacceptable. So I hope the Commission will respond to this later on. In its summit in Brussels, the European Council referred to the question of the situation of Roma in Europe. The Commission was asked to come forward with a proposal as to what the European Union can realistically hope to do with a view to supporting those member states which have large groups of Roma in their population, exchange of experience, better ways of targeting EU funding, in particular European Union funds, so as to improve the situation of Roma. This has become more pressing because recent enlargements, both this year and in 2004, were in effect accompanied by a commitment to help them with the problems of the Roma. I was responsible for the report in Slovakia. I remember that a great deal was done back then, and back at that time I asked about the effectiveness of some of the aid which was being given. So Roma aren't a traditional national minority such as Bulgarians in countries around them or Hungarians in Slovakia and so on, but they should be subject to a specific European minority policy where we recognise their specific characteristics, and this could be based on the European Council position adopted in Brussels. So I'd like to ask the Commission, when it comes to coordination, what can be done so as to improve coordination, what can be done so as to ensure that somebody within the College of Commissioners is responsible specifically for Roma policy. Finally, we should perhaps try to focus on the question as to whether Roma can be recognised as a pan-European minority. This means that we could then make them eligible for money for minority funding. I think that we can improve coordination in this field, and a great deal more effective action really is very much necessary.
And now the last question from Mrs. Moransky for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. President, my honourable fellow members, let me remind you that this very parliament first called attention to the issue of the integration of the Roma in 1983 and then repeatedly in 1994, calling upon the Commission, the Council and the Member States to do their best to further the social, economic and political integration of the Roma. As you probably remember, in our resolution of April 2005, this legislature asked the Commission to elaborate an action plan and recommendations for the Member States and the candidate countries on the integration of the Roma. Then repeatedly in November of last year, following my proposal, the Parliament resolution talked about a European Roma strategy and the social integration of the Roma. We once again called upon the Commission to, as soon as possible, elaborate a European strategy on the social integration of the Roma, making use of the Integration Fund and the structural funds. But we know that at least in 10 member states, segregation is common practice in education, and it's also common practice to qualify Roma children as mentally disabled, stigmatizing them for life. Unfortunately, we know exactly where the Roma slums and camps are, where people live in abominable conditions. We also know that the life expectancy of the Roma are about 15 years below the European average. Let me say once again that the Roma are overrepresented in terms of among the unemployed in each and every member state. Hardly a month passes without some racist motivated attack against the Roma in one member state or another. It was not widely reported, but on the 4th of January this year, a Roma camp or slum was torched in the Marconi district of Roma, while the 250 Roma were in their shacks. 3 days later, in Aprilia, again in Italy, Molotov cocktails were thrown on a Roma camp, endangering the lives of the people living there. Both attacks were motivated by racism. Undoubtedly, we need to talk about this issue, we need a resolution, we need a European strategy, and we need action plans in each and every member state to integrate the Roma into society. There are no exceptions. We must face up to the facts, not put our heads into the sand and ignore the problems. These facts hold true in each and every member state. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you very much. And now give the floor to the Commission, represented by Mrs. Ferrero-Waldner. Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, members. First of all, I'd like to thank Mrs. Yaroka, Mrs. Angelilli, Mr. Vilsma and Mrs. Mohachi for these questions, which I will deal with on behalf of my colleague Mr. Spiedler, because he's in Kenya at the moment, China at the moment. And these give us an excellent opportunity to discuss this very important subject. Last year showed that the EU institutions and the member states themselves are strengthening their efforts to bring long-lasting improvements to the situation of the Roma in Europe, and we know that's important, and I agree with that. Some important steps have been taken. There was a resolution from the European Parliament in 2005. Then there was the European Year of Equality for Everyone. And we've also had a high-level group working on the integration of ethnic minorities. And the Economic and Social Committee has also been involved. And we've recently had conclusions from the European Council in December that were just mentioned. Let me say that the thorny issue of discrimination as suffered by Roma people and their exclusion from society, from the labour market, is something that we cannot accept. We are absolutely determined to use all instruments at our disposal, such as legislation, structural funds, or information and awareness raising campaigns. We want to make use of this to improve the situation. It is obvious that employment and social programs need to be used, as well as increasing the social situation, improving the social situation of Roma. But that's not enough. We have to improve the access to these measures with a special concept. And of course, this kind of concept has to be based on decisive long-term commitment by the member states, as well as true deployment of community instruments and policies. If I may, I would now like to answer your questions more specifically and say something about our proposals for 2008. First of all, this summer, the Commission will be publishing a communication on the reworked strategy on the fight against discrimination. That is a follow-up measure to the European Year of Equal Opportunities for All. That communication, in line with the Council's conclusions from December 2007, will focus on the specific problems of the Roma and will also work on the basis of the high-level group's recommendations. That communication will then be fleshed out by a working paper of the Commission services, which look at the progress that's been made and the effectiveness of these measures at political and legislative level. But it will also take into account the programming of structural funds and how that's been used to help the Roma. At the same time, we would like to hold a Roma forum. This should bring together representatives from national governments and parliaments, European Parliament representatives, representatives from the Economic and Social Committee, as well as the Committee of Regions. We'll also be inviting along leading personalities from the Roma community, as well as other key players. We are convinced that if we have a high-level, open discussion, we'll be able to strengthen Roma rights and we'll be able to use resources to help them. My staff and Spidler's staff will be preparing these initiatives and will be focusing on the Roma question in the areas of non-discrimination, the European Social Fund, employment and social integration. Given that the situation of the Roma is cross-cutting, such as regional policy, education, home affairs and justice, the expert group that was set up in 2004, which covers many different departments, will be exchanging information and working together. A few weeks ago, in fact, the Commission signed a partnership agreement with ERIO, the Information Bureau for Roma. This partnership should provide ongoing contact between the European institutions and the Roma civil society. Furthermore, in connection with the European Year for Intercultural Dialogue, which has just started this year, many different actions will be carried out at European and national level. These are aiming to increase dialogue between cultures and to show the advantages of having cultural plurality within our societies, and effectively to raise awareness amongst the general public. In the spring of 2008, the Commission will be publishing a green paper on education together with school children coming from ethnic minorities or from a disadvantaged minority. This will also deal with Roma issues such as segregation in schools. That green paper should open up a wide-ranging debate and should lead to a Europe-wide action plan. And let me add now, to answer Mrs. Morachi's question, that in 2008 the Commission will publish a draft directive for equal treatment outside the area of employment. This will be a horizontal directive. As you've seen, it figures in our work programme. I think I've been able to sketch out the main points in our programme, I'm keen to hear what you'll say, and at the end I'll add some comments of my own. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now the first speaker on behalf of the groups, Mrs. Anastasi for the EPP.
Thank you, President. The fact that we are holding a debate on this matter in the plenary sitting of the European Parliament is emblematic at a time at which we are assessing the role of the European Union to help the Roma people. We also have to assess the effectiveness of that action. A couple of recent events show the shortcomings in terms of European policy designed to help the Roma. And we have to ensure that we improve action to face up to the challenges facing it. Mutual recognition and the need to defend minorities are founding principles of the European Union. The Roma are an important minority in the European Union, have a major impact on the socio-economic everyday life in the European Union. This is why it's so important that we try to develop a common vision in Europe regarding the Roma population, while at the same time promoting integration of this population and ensuring that their rights be protected. I asked a question on this matter. I've been told that new proposals will be forthcoming designed to protect this minority. I would like to know first of all how the Commission intends to deal with this matter at the institutional level, so as to guarantee effective coordination when it comes to protecting the rights of the Roma. An equally important matter is the right to education, as several colleagues have underlined. In particular, I would stress that a very important aspect of education is educating everybody in the European Union to show greater tolerance. Tolerance is indeed a vital prerequisite for social integration in the European Union. If we were to promote such tolerance, this would make it easier for us to socially integrate the Roma on the one hand, while at the same time diminishing stigmatization of this part of our population. So I think it's important to draw public attention to the existence of such a programme and its implementation, and to bear this in mind when we draw up new policy decisions regarding Roma integration in the future. Many thanks. I hope this debate will lead to practical improvements in the way in which European policy is implemented to help the Roma population.
Next, Swoboda for the Socialists, 1 minute and a half.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you very much for your response, which I think does accommodate our arguments to some extent. Of course, we're impatient about this question because recent incidents have showed how urgently we need to tackle this problem. In terms of the Roma Forum, yes, we agree it's a good idea. So we agree absolutely with involving the Roma people themselves. I think it's key to take action quickly. There's a proposal, then there's discussion, and I think as a result we need to be as quick off the mark as possible, and to do this within 6 months if possible. The Parliament will be involved. Then in terms of involving local authorities, they have of course a level of goodwill in the government, and yet the mayor has to deal with the problem ultimately. I'm pleased in terms of your pledge on equal treatment, and I think this should go beyond the working place because this is a key issue that my party supports. Then, Commissioner, I should just say on behalf of our group, we know about this task force, this group. It can be rather arduous, we know that. But it would make sense if there was one commissioner who could coordinate this and take responsibility. I think that would be a good step. Or at least this should have, a commissioner should have someone responsible for this within their Directorate General. We need to be clear about who has the task, because I think that would help it in going forward. I know it's not your task, but we want to beef our policy up on this. So thank you very much, Commissioner, but let's try to push this along and speed things up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now for the ALDE group, Andrea. Thank you, President, Madam Commissioner. This debate, which has been triggered by oral questions to the Commission, is effectively a follow-up of an initiative that was taken up by the Parliament a long time ago, and which has been focusing on. Now, of course, we need an action plan to improve the situation of the Roma, given that they are not properly integrated in the social, civil sectors in the EU. The transnational nature of the Roma, which is a specific feature of theirs, means that we have to adopt a Europe-wide strategy. I believe that's important so that they can come out of the degradation they're suffering at the moment. Often they are living in inhumane conditions. And of course, this is the embodiment of social exclusion. There are many reasons for this. They end up not liking their host country and end up engaging in violence or suffering violence. Alongside guidelines that might be of assistance to local authorities in how to deal with minorities in a member state, we also need sufficient funds to cover the actions that need to be implemented. But it's not just a question of financing. What we need to do is guarantee equal access to employment, housing, education, health, etc., and to set out a framework which includes the Roma people. All of this means we have to have a holistic approach in carrying out all these different actions. That's why I myself am against having one single commissioner dealing with this matter. Now, 2 years after the 2005 Declaration on the Roma, the commitments signed up to by the Member States have not borne fruit. I'd like to ask what the Commission intends to do about that. I would like the Commission to set to work as soon as possible after the year of equal opportunities and the year of intercultural dialogue. Thank you. And now, on behalf of the Greens, Mrs. de Groen-Koevenhoven for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. The situation of the Roma as it is forces me to start with criticism. The European Commission is slow and lazy dealing with the Roma issues in Europe. Just look at the Council of Europe and the OSCE. For the last 2 decades already, they have offices fully dedicated to Roma issues. The Council of Europe has produced many specific recommendations on Roma, and the OSCE has developed its action plan on improving the situation of the Roma in the OSCE area. I wonder how attentively the Commission or the EU member states read those documents and took seriously our EP joint resolution on Roma on the Decade of Roma Inclusion Action Plans. Only criticising, it's not my political style, and Mrs. Ferrero-Waldner gave me some optimism. Therefore, Madam Commissioner, please share the following message with President Barroso and the colleagues once you meet. First, creation of the European Roma strategy should begin as soon as possible and should primarily focus on improving the living conditions of the Roma in Europe, creating jobs for almost 90% jobless Roma, combating the anti-Gypsyism, supporting the education of Roma, bringing health in the Roma houses, and promoting Roma political inclusion. Second, for such creation, the European Commission needs a Roma unit as a permanent body. Hiring Roma staff should serve the structure. I sincerely hope that you will hire Roma staff based on their skills rather than on their skin, as some member states did in the past. Third, a special European fund for Roma projects should be a priority for the European Commission. Dear colleagues, of course we, as a European Parliament, should also pay contribution towards the joint European Union efforts to improve the situation of the Roma. Here, I would like to raise again the proposal for having a permanent EP rapporteur on Roma issues, which will give good overview and recommendations to this House other EU institutions and member states. Furthermore, I would also like to hear louder the voice of the Roma in this House. Their interests should be represented by their MEPs. Finally, I want to underline that the European Roma strategy has its common political values when it comes to future enlargement process and fight against ultranationalism and extreme right in Europe. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. And now for 2 minutes for the GUI group, Agnoletto.
Grazie. E ringrazio la
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the Commissioner for what she said and for the commitments she's taken on. I think these are in line with what has been approved by the Parliament on a number of occasions. But these pledges are not enough on their own. I want to ask what instruments the Commission will be using. What can the Commission tell us in terms of the use of funds, which under different spending chapters have been made available to states for integrating the Roma? What checks and balances is the Commission putting in place to see the implementation of the measures? I'd also like to see a clear spokesman in the Commission, one person dealing with all Roma issues. Then, in terms of Italy, I have to state that we can see a clear wave of racism and stigmatisation of the Roma people. Of course, Italy hasn't fully transposed Directive 2043. So what measures does the Commission intend to put in place in terms of this? In Italian law, there's no question of harassment on the basis of race or ethnicity. So I'd like to ask the Commission what it's doing. In terms of the population in Italy, we can see in Milan there are a number of young people whose parents are not properly signed up with the authorities. They don't have the right papers, so therefore they can't go to school. And I think this is in contradiction with the EU's policy. It's in contradiction with the European Union Charter and also the resolution on the rights of the child. I'd also like to state how the Italian government is now looking at the umpteenth law on the question of the Roma people. And now it's a question of trying to define whether there could be some kind of reference in terms of economic purposes for returning an individual to their member state. Well, I think this is something that needs to be dealt with specifically with regard to the Roma people. Interested in your opinion.
And now for the non-attached to Mr. Chuklov for 2 minutes.
Уважаеми колеги, вземам думата и аз, за да се чуе една...
Thank you, President. I'd like to follow from previous speakers so as to ensure that, for once at least, we really are aware of what's going on. And I would like to correct some of the hypocritical points made up until now. My main conclusion, in the light of what's been said, is that you're very concerned by the situation of gypsy minorities in Europe. However, you don't seem to care very much about the terrible situation faced by retired people in Bulgaria, or all the poor Bulgarians who have to get up early to go to work and suffer from crime committed by gypsies. I would also remind you that the Bulgarian Socialist Party regularly buys the votes of the gypsy minority in Bulgaria. And that the Liberty Party, which is the part of the government coalition, which is part of the ALDE group in the European Parliament, also buys gypsy votes. The president of this group describes this practice of buying votes as standard practice in the European Union. The gypsy minority in Bulgaria accounts for 3 or 4% of the population, whereas they account for a very high proportion of crimes committed. And these crimes aren't all due to poverty. In many cases, such crimes involve unprovoked violence. We have many old people who are killed for no reason whatsoever. The money actually allocated to helping gypsies is swallowed up by the government apparatus. So my own group, Ataka, believes that the main solution to this problem is to ensure that we have full compliance with legislation. legislation must be respected regardless of what the situation of these minorities is. In Bulgaria, crimes committed by gypsies are never subject to proceedings. The murder of two sisters was never properly investigated by the police, despite the absolute outcry on the part of the majority.
And now Mrs. Levi for 1 minute, 30 seconds.
Mr. President, honourable colleagues, I was happy to hear the words of Commissioner Ferrero-Waldner, and I was also happy to hear about the initiatives that are hopefully going to happen in the near future. This should improve the situation of the Roma. But I must agree with my Dutch colleague who voiced his impatience. Many of us are impatient because little is happening. 7 to 9 million Roma live in Europe in unthinkable social conditions, facing the same problems that they faced years ago: discrimination, seclusion, lack of employment, segregation in education, and the multiple discrimination of Roma women. Most of the member states do not consider the Roma a national minority and are not really doing much to improve their situation. Unfortunately, we have seen a revival of radicalism and anti-Roma sentiments in recent years, both in new and old member states. Therefore, I believe that we have no more time to waste. We must act now and act together. We need a European Roma strategy and Roma policy, without which there can be no national Roma policy and Roma strategy, which is something we must understand and face up to. We should take steps to recognize the Roma as a transnational minority, because they do have a special status. The Socialist group in the European Parliament has already launched an action plan. In March we are embarking on a European-wide tour, conferences, workshops, visits, with the inclusion of the local Roma groups, NGOs and local governments, to direct attention to the unacceptable situation of the Roma in Europe and hopefully improve it. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Mr. Severin, a minute and a half.
Mr. Chairman, Roma are neither the successors of the ancient Roman Empire nor the contemporary inhabitants of Rome. They are neither a nation without a state nor a national minority. They are an ethno-cultural community still cherishing its tribal tradition, and a pan-European community which was kept in slavery in the pre-modern and early modern Europe, which was sent in extermination camps by the fascist regimes, which was closed in the states transformed into prisons by the communist dictatorship, which became free European citizens after the end of the Cold War and the first post-bipolar European Union enlargement. Being marginalised and excluded along the centuries, the Roma community found itself outside the European wells and tried to protect itself by challenging the European order. Today, after Europe reconciled with itself, should it reconcile with the Roma population as well, or should it declare and treat Roma as second-class citizens who are again to be concentrated in some member states transformed into Roma ghettos? To these questions there is a single answer. The Roma issue is a European issue. It is not a simple issue, but a huge challenge, a common challenge which we must cope with jointly. Otherwise, we will be unable to integrate the Roma community in European society, to bring it in the European order. This is a cultural and social matter. The European Union should mobilise funds, develop programmes and organise specific institutional structures in order to assist the national authorities of the countries where Roma choose to settle, in order to offer this community a decent material life, a proper education, a fair opportunity to compete with the others free of any discrimination, and a cohesive sense of their existence within the European civilisation. We expect that the European Commission will make the right step in that direction and will keep the European Parliament fully informed on the progress achieved. Thank you.
Mr. Anderson,
Mr. Anderson for a minute and a half. Thank you, President, Madam Commissioner. When we were discussing the Lisbon strategy in the Employment Committee, of course, we talked about high growth And we talked about a high level of employment. We talk about good social conditions, good social security, healthcare. And we also say that building up skills and education has to be the driving force for us to be able to achieve and maintain that. If we look at all these objectives in terms of the Roma, then actually we can see that there's a high level of unemployment. We see pretty bad social conditions. We see a poor level of health and healthcare, a segregated society, and they're also segregated in education. In particular, if we look at the teaching system, they simply don't get a good education. But Lisbon is supposed to apply to everyone. We had a report on this, but we're lagging behind, so it's absolutely essential for us to have an action plan. We also have to have mainstreaming, but at the same time we need coordination within the Commission. It's important for us to assess everything and make sure we target it to the Roma. In employment and social affairs, we have to make sure that we bear in mind the situation of the Roma so that they're included into these strategies. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Tabajdi for 1 minute and a half.
Mr. President, the European Union doesn't have a common minority policy, neither for the Roma nor for the traditional minorities, and not even for the migrant or immigrant minorities. I consider the Roma a traditional minority, but due to their social situation, they should be treated separately. I am happy that as the living conscience of the European Parliament, the two Roma members, Ms. Járóka and Ms. Mohácsi, posed this oral question, along with others of course, because in November, when we adopted our resolution on the incident in Italy, we never thought that we had to come back to this issue so often, but we have to come back to it again and again. I welcome the words of Commissioner Ferrero-Waldner. The European Union does have a task, does have a role to play, but there are European competencies and national member state competencies which should be separated. And I agree with Hannes Swoboda, not because we used to be part of the same Austro-Hungarian monarchy, but I agree with Hannes Swoboda because it's all decided on the local level whether the program is successful. It's the member state that needs an action plan, and I am proud to say that it was during my term as a state secretary that we elaborated the first such action plan in Hungary. Everything is decided on the ground at the local level. What can the EU do? Well, it has to monitor what's done at the national level. It has to circulate best practices, issue guidelines, and show that it's not only a question of money, but also a question of well-prepared experts, because we have to find the people among the Roma and among mainstream society who want to act together to improve the situation of the Roma and of the migrants.
Thank you. Thank you. For the 1 minute speeches, Mr. Rubik has asked for the floor from the EPP.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner. Ladies and gentlemen. Well, firstly, I'd like to reject the criticism that Mr. Spiedler is too lazy to deal with this problem. I don't think that's the right tone in this House. I think in terms of the Roma strategy, we should focus on improving education for young people, because we all know of the obligation to go to school. And I think it's important to use language, to learn maths. They're all key tools for a successful life. And I think we should absolutely make this possible in this area. However, I do understand that not everybody wants to be integrated, and as such we should offer alternatives for those who don't want to integrate into our society. And I think this notion of tackling this problem freely, I think, is the key solution for our future.
Thank you. And the last request for the floor, Mr. Beasley, please, for 1 minute.
Presidente, thank you. I think this debate has highlighted a number of the problems that the subject we are debating has raised. It simply seems to me, Commissioner, that rather than us devising a strategy and telling other people what to do, it would perhaps be wise to ask representatives of the Roma community. We know we have 2 MEPs currently elected. I remember there was a very famous Spanish socialist member of this House elected in 1989 who was particularly engaging and informative on the whole question of Roma culture, which is part of our culture. It is part of European civilisation. What kind of a people are we? I believe that perhaps it is wise just to regard the history of the Roma people, to speak with representatives of the Roma culture, and to ask them how we can best forward the prospects, rather than telling them how they integrate into our society, how we can best accommodate their social needs.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor back to the Commissioner, Mrs. Ferrero-Waldner. Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, perhaps I should sum up. It was a very interesting debate, and I think we can all see how important it is to act on this. And of course you want us to react as quickly as possible. And I should say that there's a directive here, Directive 2043 from the European Community, which guarantees the application of the principle of equal treatment without any differences on the basis of race or ethnicity in education, in health and social services, and in terms of access to goods and services. And that, of course, applies to the Roma too. That's key. And, of course, it makes it possible for member states to take positive measures. However, it's true that there's no obligation for member states to transpose these measures into national law. The European legislation, however, must be applied. And as a Commission, we're absolutely determined to ensure that this is implemented. Last year, the Commission instituted infringement proceedings against 22 member states because they had not implemented European rules correctly. And Mr. Agnoletto, I have to say that Italy was one of these member states. In terms of the inclusion of people in the labour market, the European Social Fund, of course, is the key instrument we have. A key part of the measures that try to improve the employability of Roma can be co-financed by the European Social Fund, because there was a question about finances. From 2002 to 2006, around 275 million euros went towards integrating Roma into society. The high-level expert group for the integration of ethnic minorities stated that certain ESF projects like Acceder in Spain, for example, had enabled effective integration of the Roma. So I would like to appeal to member states to make use of the options, and I agree with MEPs that it's not just about national bodies, but also local authorities that play a key part in this. Roma social exclusion is, of course, a very complex question. And in order to overcome this, we need a uniform approach which deals with all the key aspects of Roma life. That's the approach we need to take. Education, employment, health, housing, infrastructure, these are the key areas. And this approach requires effective coordination between the European institutions. I think we will make substantial progress in the coming year with these measures. I've heard that some of you, not all of you, would like to see a single commissioner that deals with this issue. And of course, I'll pass this message on to Commissioner Spiedler. But there are a number of different areas that are being discussed here. And so I think the key thing is effective coordination. Nonetheless, I think we will have to sit down and discuss this with Commissioner Spiedler. Just to pick up on a few points that came out in the debate, there was a reference to the question of dialogue with civil society and, of course, with the Roma themselves. We know that this dialogue is critical, and we know that it's important for Roma and their children. We need to guarantee the principle of non-discrimination. We need to work towards greater employment and social development in certain areas, and also to try to break down some of the barriers that are in people's heads so that Roma people are acknowledged as being part of European culture. I agree with everyone that's made this point. Anyone who knows me will be aware that I always work for human rights education. We talked here about education in terms of tolerance. That I agree with, and I will indeed try to bring this question of human rights education into the communication because I think it's critical. Mrs. de Groen-Koevenhoorn, slow, maybe, but not lazy. And if you see that the Council of Europe and the OSCE have instituted a number of plans with support from the European Commission, then you can see that there are some very positive approaches out there. Then finally, on the question of transnational minority, well, I should say that we should bear in mind the fact that the EU doesn't have the competence for this in terms of defining minorities in member states. And you should realise that social policy measures shouldn't be looking at ethnic origin but should focus on individual requirements. But as you know, member states have very differing views in terms of what constitutes a minority and how you define it. So this question will no doubt not be answered so quickly. Otherwise, I will pass the message on and you can guarantee that there will be a communication. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That concludes this discussion. The vote will take place on the 31st of January 2008. We now proceed on the joint debate.